All right, as I said, we are just cruising through these 4 chapters on the cranial nerves, the brainstem, the visual system, and the vestibular system, just hitting the high points. We're not getting into a lot of depth. So if you want more depth, that's a great thing for continuing ed later on. But we're just going to hit the high points and the basic functions of each system and some disorders. So the learning objectives for the visual system, primary functions of the visual system, you're not surprised about that, are you? There are some objectives of eye movements that we're going to look over, a brief description of the vestibular ocular reflex, and the etiology, pathology, signs, and symptoms of bitemporal hemianopsia and homonymous hemianopsia. And those are words that you usually have to practice saying because you know they're fairly unpronounceable, but they sometimes it's also called bitemporal hemianopia or homonymous hemianopia. But either way is correct. So the visual system provides sight at a basic level. No surprise there. It also provides processing of visual information like recognition and location of objects. The control of eye movement, so the muscular control of eye movement, and information used in postural and limb movement control. So pretty important, right? Can you live without some of those things? Absolutely. Is it ideal? Absolutely not. So we have a lot of resources in our brain and nervous system dedicated to vision. And as humans, we're very visually oriented. Sight is the information conveyed from the retina to the cerebral cortex. So the visual pathway starts with cells in the retina that convert light into neural signals. And they do it in a very cool way on a cellular level. We are not going to talk about that right now, but if you ever want to study further into the nervous system, the vision system is a very cool area of study. Signals are processed within the retina, and so the retina are our transducers. They're transducing light into neural signals. Those neural signals are then conveyed to the retinal output cells, and the retinal output is conveyed by axons that travel in the optic nerve, optic chiasm, and the optic tract. Synapses in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus um, then send the information to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Okay, very interesting, right? So there's a lot going on in that little pathway there. There's a lot of nerves crossing from one side to the other, and it affects what kind of pathologies we have later on. So optic nerve is the bundle of axons that pass from the retina to the optic chiasm. So the optic chiasm is the area in the middle where some of the nerves cross over to the other side and some do not. So the nerves merge from left and right. They merge at the optic chiasm, and some cross the midline, but some don't. So when you look at the color coding in this picture, we have the right half of the right eye and the right half of the left eye. Those are in red. And then we have the left half of the right eye and the left half of the left eye, and those are in blue. So very interesting. So the left half of the right eye crosses over and the left half of the left eye doesn't. The right half of the left eye crosses over and the right half of the right eye doesn't. So when we look at some of the disorders, you'll see why this is important. So we don't strictly have like, here's our right eye vision and here's our left eye vision. They coordinate together to give us the information that we need, which is super interesting. The optic tract, once you pass the optic chiasm, then the optic tract conveys that visual information to the lateral geniculate, which is a nucleus in the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it goes to the visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe. So information that reaches the primary visual cortex stimulates neurons that discriminate the shape, size, and texture of objects. Information conveyed to the visual association cortex is analyzed for colors and motion. So there's a lot going on. It's not just we see something and we know what it is. Um, the action stream is a stream of visual information that flows dorsally and is used to direct movement. The perception stream is a stream of visual information that flows ventrally and is used to recognize visual objects. So very interesting. So when you have lesions in the visual system, um, where the damage is going to change what kind of visual loss you have. So visual losses are usually described by referring to the visual field deficit, so what's missing. And the visual field deficit is going to be different depending on where the lesion is along that pathway. So complete interruption of the optic nerve results in ipsilateral blindness on that side and loss of direct pupillary light reflex. So if your right optic nerve has a lesion, you're going to be blind in your right eye. The optic nerve is entirely myelinated by oligodendroglia and is frequently affected by multiple sclerosis. So a lot of times with MS, one of the first symptoms people report is visual disturbances. Visual field deficits are described by the visual loss that you experience depending on where the lesion is. So a complete lesion of the retina or the optic nerve results in total loss of vision in that eye, the eye on that side. If you lose information in both temporal visual fields, which is the closer to your ears, if you want to think of it that way, it's called bilateral hemianopia. So basically you lose the right side of the right eye and the left side of the left eye. And that's depicted in number 2 in this diagram. So you have the middle part, you have the inner part, but you don't have the outer part. Homonymous hemianopsia is the loss of visual information from the same visual field, right or left, in both eyes. So you lose, like in number 3 on here, it's the left side of the left eye and the left side of the right eye. So what it ends up looking like is a visual field cut where you can see the right side of the visual field, but you don't see the left side of the visual field. Very interesting. This homonymous hemianopsia happens a lot with CVAs, particularly middle cerebral artery CVAs or posterior artery CVAs because it affects the occipital lobe. Someone who has cortical blindness is due to a lesion in the visual cortex. So they don't have any awareness of visual information. However, someone who has cortical blindness can often orient to or point to or detect movement of visual objects as long as they still have innervation in the retina. So they don't have awareness of the visual information, but they can orient to it. And it's called blind sight, which is super interesting. And when we talk about CVAs, we'll talk about the symptoms of CVAs in particular areas. So there are 2 objectives of eye movements. One of them is keeping the position of the eyes stable during head movements, and the other one is directing the gaze at visual targets. So gaze stabilization or visual fixation during head movements is achieved by the vestibular ocular reflex and optokinetic nystagmus, and we'll talk about what those are. So the direction of gaze is accomplished by saccades, which are fast movements that switch gaze from one object to another. So it's like when you're quickly moving your head and your eyes are moving from one object to another. Smooth pursuits are eye movements that follow a moving object. So that's like watching cars on a highway, and your eyes are following those moving objects. Vergence movements are movements of the eyes toward or away from the midline to adjust to different distances between the eyes and the visual target. So if you take a pen or your thumb or whatever and hold it out at arm's length and move it in closer to you, the eyes will move toward the midline to adjust and focus on that point. And the point at which it becomes hard to focus on can be measured. So it's a measurable thing. The vestibular ocular reflex, so it takes information from the vestibular nerve and from the vision system. It stabilizes visual images during head movements. That totally is useful out in the real world. As you're moving around, you have to be able to focus on things. So the vestibular ocular reflex does that. Vestibular receptors for the VOR are in the vestibular apparatus, which is 3 fluid-filled tubes inside the inner ear called the semicircular canals. And stimulating a pair of semicircular canals induces eye movements in roughly the same plane as the canal. So our vision and our vestibular function is linked. So when you get conflicting information from the visual system and the vestibular system, that often causes motion sickness. So optokinetic nystagmus adjusts eye positions during slow head movements. So when you're walking along, your head moves relative to objects in the environment. And if the visual stimuli move, like I said, like watching cars on the highway, the movement of your eyes allow the eyes to follow large objects in the visual field. So that's pretty handy in day-to-day life if you don't want to get hit by a car when you're out there walking. So there is physiological nystagmus, which we just talked about, and there's pathological nystagmus. So physiological nystagmus is a normal response that can be elicited in an intact nervous system with optokinetic stimulation, meaning you're looking at something that's moving. It can also be elicited by rotational or temperature stimulation of the semicircular canals, or by moving the eyes to an extreme horizontal position. So the side eye, looking out of the corner of your eye. Pathologic nystagmus is a sign of nervous system abnormality. So it can be indicative of a lot of different types of dysfunction, one of them being a vestibular dysfunction, which we'll talk about in the next section. Lots of things can influence the direction of gaze, influence eye movements, auditory information. You hear something, it stimulates you looking over there. Your vestibular ocular reflex can influence eye movements. Visual stimuli, see something and your eyes will move towards it. Sensory information from extraocular muscles and the emotional system can influence eye movements. So when we're reading or doing other activities where the visual object is near your eyes, so you're knitting or you're reading or something like that, the eyes are aimed more towards the midline to allow the image to fall on corresponding areas of the retinas in right and left. So convergence is normal. If your convergence isn't working, sometimes that results in diplopia, double vision, or blurred vision. So that's something you can test and measure, which is pretty interesting. After a concussion or with vestibular disorders, there's often disturbances in convergence movements. Motion sickness is usually nausea, headache, anxiety, sometimes vomiting, experienced in moving vehicles. It can be caused by a conflict between different types of sensory information, or postural instability. Seasickness may be caused by a conflict between visual and vestibular information. So your vision's telling you one thing and your vestibular system's telling you another. If you're prone to motion sickness, then you know well how that can be. You can habituate to motion sickness. It's not pleasant, but you can do it. I'm a motion sickness person, so I can relate.